G'day everybody, my name is Lowell and welcome to the channel. So we have a reaction video. This is going to be the biggest freeze, Montreal's catastrophic ice storm 1998. Never heard anything about this before. So let's jump in and let's have a look at this one. Oh damn.
26 years ago, one of the most incredible winter storms hit the St. Lawrence Valley. For 4 consecutive days, freezing rain fell from Kingston, Ontario to Bangor, Maine, resulting in over 3 inches of accumulated ice. The incredible weight toppled
3 inches of ice.
17,000 telephone poles and 1,300 electric transmission towers, destroyed millions of trees, halted all travel, and made the daily routines of modern society nearly impossible in Montreal. Following one of the warmest years on record in Canada, the sudden severity and lengthy duration of the ice storm took many by surprise. Today, we'll investigate the role our friend El Nino played in this devastating event, learn how ice this thick can accumulate in the perfect conditions, and review in depth the indescribable damage from one of the worst natural disasters in Canadian history. The state of the global atmosphere leading up to this event was unsurprisingly warm. Since the slow increase in the average temperature at the start of the 1900s, 1997 was the warmest year on record, and the North American higher latitudes felt it. Starting around January of 1997, ocean monitors detected a large area of warmer water about 500 feet deep in the western Pacific. Over the next couple months, this warm water would expand to the surface and eastward, eventually pulling off the coast of Peru. This is called El Nino, and it's a naturally occurring oscillation that happens on average every 3 to 4 years, with some variability. This warmer water was observed as far west as French Polynesia and was as warm as 12 degrees Celsius above normal. As a strong El Nino often does,
above normal. Okay.
As this powerful oscillation had global consequences. 15 tropical cyclones formed in the South Pacific, double the annual average. In the West Pacific, 11 super typhoons formed between April and December, sporting an accumulated cyclone energy score of 570, a record that still stands to this day. In Canada, an abnormally cold start to the year transitioned into an abnormally warm spring as warmer Pacific air was transported into the Red River Basin. This melted snow and ice at an alarming rate, causing historic floods. Several levees failed in Grand Forks, North Dakota, as the Red River crested to 54 feet, spilling water 3 miles into the city.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
While the summer stayed comparatively cool in the Midwest, central and eastern Canada saw one of the warmest and driest on record. Nova Scotia saw only 10% of its monthly average rainfall in July, and the Ottawa Valley suffered a similar fate. While this made the growing season more difficult, the mild weather continued well into fall, allowing for a proper extended harvest that Canadians normally don't get to enjoy. As the El Nino only intensified heading into winter, the warmer temperatures were likely to stay. As long-wave troughs in the jet stream meandered across the United States with their associated cyclones below, it became clear that the southwestern and northeastern United States were disproportionately getting hit with heavy snow. On October 25th, a strong surface low developed beneath a cutoff low in the jet stream near the Four Corners, pulling moisture into eastern Colorado. The clash with cold Canadian air resulted in explosive snowfall of over 4 feet in the eastern half of the state. On November 16th, a foot of snow fell in Portland, Maine, after a New England low deepened rapidly when moving off the coast. On Thanksgiving and Black Friday, another cutoff low moved ashore into California, traversing the Rocky Mountains, dropping several feet of snow in central Colorado. On December 3rd, a deep low over Arizona dumped over a foot in the higher elevations of New Mexico and Colorado. This pattern continued over the next several weeks, which concluded with a major winter storm in the Northeast on December 29th. As the cyclone responsible for the snow moved offshore over the Atlantic Ocean, a large-scale change began to occur. A strong surface high containing frigid air from northern Canada began to slide southward into the upper Midwest on New Year's Day. This front was very slow-moving and took 3 days to push down into Kansas, and then it stopped. A significant temperature gradient existed along the front from Abilene, Texas, all the way up to Maine. But you might notice something a bit peculiar about this map. As the Canadian air sagged southward, a secondary area of high pressure was building westward from the Atlantic Ocean to the east of the Carolinas. This high was obviously much warmer than the Canadian high, and it helped to create that stationary front, or non-moving temperature boundary. Now here's where things get interesting and complicated. Directly above this stationary front, the jet stream had actually split, which is somewhat rare. Two jet streaks, or bands of fast-moving air, existed over eastern Quebec and California, but nothing over the central US, which created sort of a holding pattern. The rapid flow of air that high in the atmosphere is what helps to push these storm systems across the country, so that lack of movement meant that the weather at the surface was going to be stagnant. But it didn't mean that it was going to be dry. Back at the surface, the subsiding or sinking air was moving in a clockwise motion around the two areas of high pressure. Right along the stationary front, you had northeasterly winds pushing 45-degree air at the surface. But right at the frontal boundary, they were met by southerly 65-degree air flowing around the Atlantic high. This zone of convergence meant that the warmer air from the Atlantic would rise over top of the colder Canadian air, creating a wide swath of rain. When air converges, it rises, and when it rises, it creates clouds and precipitation. Over an inch of rain fell in western Ohio and central Oklahoma, the areas of strongest convergence. Not only did this pattern create a wide swath of rain, but it also resulted in two other anomalies. One, because of the orientation of the highs, between them was technically a trough of lower pressure. This is a warm inverted trough, and it's pretty rare, much more common down in the tropics. The second anomaly was a deep pocket of warmer air that existed a few thousand feet in the atmosphere above upstate New York. The warmer air from the Atlantic high was lifted as the colder air from the Canadian high stayed near the surface. The next weather system that would move through the area would interact with these anomalous air masses, and the meteorologists recognized this. But they didn't predict a $5 billion disaster. Ooh. Starting on January...
I gotta say, all of these, weather fronts and everything, it kind of almost seems like, they're all kind of converging into like a perfect storm or something. They're all kind of interacting and everything else, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And as he said, 5 billion, it's like, dang.
Small surface lows would form within the inverted trough over Texas and move along the stationary front. Remember, cyclones move along temperature gradients. While they tracked northeast, they pulled in tons of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, bringing it into the colder climates where it would fall as rain and snow. The concern here wasn't a major snowstorm. Remember, the jet stream was split, and you need that strong jet stream for a cyclone to turn into a winter storm with high winds and Arctic blast and feet of snow. These weaker lows weren't that, but rather the environment they were moving into was perfect for one of the deadliest forms of precipitation: freezing rain. This is how freezing rain works in a mid-latitude cyclone. When the cyclone forms, let's say over Texas, as they often do in the winter, and starts to move across the country, they take on a very familiar shape. To the southeast of the low center, it's often warm and dry, but to the north, there exists a swath of precipitation called the deformation zone. Warm air gets pumped northward ahead of the cold front, and it rises and then gets stretched. The low pulls some of it to the west where it wraps around the backside, but some of it gets pushed further east ahead of the warm front. This stretching or deforming is called the deformation zone, and because of this deformation, there is less air and therefore lower pressure in this area. This means that air from the surface is able to quickly rise and condense, creating a large swath of rain and snow. If you look at the GFS weather model, pretty much any point in winter, you can see the telltale deformation zone on the northern side of a forming cyclone. They are a dime a dozen in the United States. But the problem with the deformation zone in the winter is that the zone encompasses both above and below freezing temperatures. If you look at a vertical cross-section of the deformation zone, you can see at the southern end along the warm front, the air is both warmer at the surface and higher up in the atmosphere. But as you move further north, the cold air wedges itself underneath the warm air until it exists within the entire column on the far northern side. Keep in mind that above the 700 millibar level in winter, the air is freezing all around, so all this precipitation starts out as ice crystals above 700 millibars. My question for you is that if precipitation exists in this entire zone, where does it snow and where does it rain? Well, obviously it rains in the warm sector and it snows in the cold sector. And right in the middle, a mix of both: sleet, wintry mix, what have you. But right here is the Goldilocks zone. If the air in this warm sector is about 38 degrees Fahrenheit or above, and this pocket of freezing cold air stretches from the ground to about 1,500 feet high, then liquid water will fall through the pocket of cold air and quickly freeze on the Earth's surface. This is how freezing rain happens, and the particular atmospheric conditions are why it often only happens in a 50-kilometer or 30-mile wide corridor in the deformation zone. The reason why ice storms happen is because early on in a cyclone's life, the general atmospheric profile stays relatively stationary, and the deformation zone moves parallel to it, meaning that freezing rain can occur for hours along that narrow corridor. So in order to have a historic ice storm, you would need a much larger area of freezing air at the surface with warmer air aloft, along a stationary temperature gradient that doesn't get moved for several days. Additionally, you need a parade of weaker low-pressure systems consecutively moving through the area, just strong enough that they contain heavy precipitation within the deformation zone, but not so strong that the frontal system moves south or north. And wouldn't you know it, this is exactly what happened in the St. Lawrence Valley in January of 1998. As the Canadian high moved freezing air at the surface into the St. Lawrence Valley, the Atlantic high injected warm, moist air aloft into the region. And in the middle of the day on January 4th, the precipitation started. What appeared to be just rain fell onto a 29-degree Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius, southern Ontario and Quebec. And immediately, a thin layer of ice started to form. The good news was that there was snow and slush already on the road, so driving wasn't affected right away. But walking definitely was, and even if you wanted to drive, you'd have to chip away at your windshield to even get on the road.
Jesus.
This is a pretty typical accumulation of ice from a single cyclone, but this was only day one. On the morning of the 5th, with another low moving up from the Gulf, it became clear that this was not going to stop, and most schools in the Montreal area were closed for the day. 15,000 trees across the city had already collapsed from the added weight of hundreds of pounds of ice, falling onto cars and power lines. By the afternoon, a westerly wind had picked up, putting more stress on power lines. In Drummondville, about 60 miles northeast of Montreal on Trans-Canada 1, 8 electric transmission towers collapsed. Now, it's important to mention that it's not just the weight of the ice on the tower itself that's responsible for a collapse, but rather the process of ice shedding. Ice will build up on transmission lines, and when the wind causes the ice to rapidly crack and fall off, the sudden reduction in weight and tension on the power line causes a longitudinal vibration that can pull the tower down. 90% of transmission tower collapses result from this phenomenon.
Okay, so it's not just the weight, but it's that vibration that kind of loosens the... Oh, man, that is some scary stuff. And then obviously if that all goes down, then your grid is going down as well too. So, you know, you've got freezing rain, dropping temperatures, you know, I guess all your, I don't know, you know, obviously I don't live in Canada. I don't know how much is that wood fire? Is it all electric heating? I don't know. Let me know. But I can just imagine that, you know, the issues that are going to come with, you know, all your electrical power lines are falling down. It's going to cause some real trouble.
At the end of the day, nearly 1 million Quebec residents were without power, and shelters began to open for those without heat. On January 6th, the zone of freezing rain shifted slightly south, disproportionately affecting the south side of Montreal.
Oh, wow.
Residents who decided to stay home likely had some way of creating heat, like a fireplace that they didn't use often, but were forced to now. Unfortunately, this resulted in the first of many house fires to come. On January 7th, the potential for freezing rain peaked. An Arctic high over Newfoundland was now moving westward towards Quebec, reinforcing the pressure and temperature gradients along the stationary front. The colder surface air had moved south into central Maine, which was now within the freezing rain zone. A stronger low had formed near the Gulf beneath a deep long-wave trough, which was pumping so much moisture into the northeast that meteorologists believed this would be the record-breaking ice day. 20 to 30 mile an hour gusts knocked over tens of thousands of middle-aged trees. Even if residents wanted to leave their homes to access a shelter, there was no way to get into their cars. Ice accumulation was now well over an inch. With Hydro-Canada Power Company deep underwater, American companies like Asplund from Pennsylvania were called in to help remove the fallen and sagging trees. You couldn't go outside for more than a few minutes before hearing the sound of tree branches crashing onto the road.
That's pretty scary. That's pretty, I mean, it looked like they're all pretty tree-lined streets as well, too. Dang.
By late in the day on January 7th, the zone of precipitation now extended from Dallas, Texas to Halifax, Nova Scotia. To the west in Ottawa, most government employees were sent home as an inch of ice now coated Canada's capital. And while Montreal was getting a short break in the action, New England was now under fire. Residents in Lewiston and Augusta woke up on the 8th to half an inch of ice on trees and power lines. Central Maine Power headquarters lost power to its offices in Augusta, making restoring power to over 600,000 residents that much more difficult. It was the worst electrical crisis in the history of the state. Dozens of people were hospitalized for carbon monoxide poisoning as they ran generators inside of their homes. At least 2 people died. Back to the west.
Oh, that's terrible, isn't it? You know, you think you're doing a good thing, but that's carbon monoxide build up and
The swath of rain over Ottawa moved into Montreal overnight, and by January 9th, downtown Montreal had finally lost power, along with 1.4 million residents. Over 1,000 transmission towers were now toppled, but thankfully, because the ice accumulation to the north of downtown was slightly less, one sole connecting transmission line between the Bouteille and Chenier substations remained unaffected. Had any of these towers fallen, all of Montreal would be in the dark. All trains east of Toronto were canceled, and many airlines in the area followed suit. Victoria Bridge, one of 3 connections between Montreal and the eastern suburbs, was closed off to the public. When Hydro-Quebec tried holding a press conference to ease the fears of the public, the power went out. Irony. Hundreds of Canadian...
Oh my God. Don't worry, everything is under control. Oh crap, the power's out. That's so scary. I wonder if they've adjusted those power poles, those electrical pylons, to not obviously happen again. You know, if they're having a massive big storm again. Is there something, you know, this is 1998, so they've had a few years to work on it. Let me know. Be interesting. I don't know if he's going to touch on it, but be interesting to see if they kind of, you know, change the design a little bit or something like that to combat these ice storms. Dang.
Military members were sent to the South Shore to help make the streets passable. The power outages meant that water filtration plants couldn't do their job, so residents were urged to boil water before consumption, despite having no power or ways to heat their homes. As the air a few thousand feet above the ground was significantly warmer, lightning flashes were reported across the St. Lawrence Valley. Many of the rural areas to the south and east of Montreal were affected way worse than the city itself. Now, when we talk about total ice accretion, it gets a little bit complicated. The shape and thickness of that ice depends on the physical properties of the object it freezes onto. While flat surfaces are likely to have a uniform layer, vertically oriented objects like signs and tree limbs are more likely to form icicles. If you want to learn more about the science of ice accretion, there's a fascinating paper written by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I linked it in the sources below. With that being said, by the end of January 9th, 3 to 4 inches of ice accretion was observed in Montreal and points east. And besides the loss of 44 human lives, mainly due to carbon monoxide poisoning, the next biggest loss might have been the trees. In 1997, Quebec alone was responsible for producing 70% of the global supply of maple syrup. It's been noted that maple trees are much more susceptible to ice-related damage than their coniferous counterparts because of their large
I never even thought of that. Obviously, trees in Canada with maple syrup. Damn, okay.
Complex crown. When ice forms on a maple tree, the extra downward weight on the branches can tear the trunk in half. Over 1 million trees across the St. Lawrence Valley and points east were damaged or destroyed, which is an incredible number. Obviously, the maple syrup industry took a hit in the following year, but many of the damaged trees were able to recover. On January 9th, the freezing rain finally stopped as the stationary front lifted to the north. With the air temperature now above freezing, but wouldn't be for long, the entire city was buzzing with utility workers, Canadian Army personnel, and general Good Samaritans trying to clear out the ice and broken tree limbs as fast as humanly possible. Downtown was still without power and quite dangerous to walk in. Huge chair-sized chunks of ice were falling from buildings and crashing into the street. The 3 bridges connecting Montreal to the South Shore were the most dangerous for this phenomenon and remained closed while crews removed the ice. But even the construction equipment used to remove the ice had trouble keeping upright. Local small business owners brought free food to the shelters, including Joe Morena of the famous St. Viateur bagel shop. Some areas on the South Shore didn't see power restored for another 3 weeks. But after grueling work put in by Hydro-Canada in sub-freezing temperatures, the power grid was eventually restored to full capacity. Damage estimates from the storm are anywhere from $5 to $7 billion US, which puts this ice storm as one of the costliest natural disasters in Canadian history. A large part of that expense was a result of the 700,000 insurance claims filed by those affected. Despite the record ice storm, the rest of the winter ended up being one of the mildest on record. In fact, 1988 was one of the warmest years in Canada up until that point. That same strong El Nino, which weakened the jet stream over the central US and helped produce that ice storm, also gave Canadians a much-deserved break from the winter cold and snow. A book that I really recommend if you want to see some cool photojournalism and some interesting stories from the event is The Ice Storm by Mark App. It has a fantastic collection of pictures. I especially like seeing these 1980s and 90s Econobox two-wheel drive cars trying to navigate the ice storm. It must have been impossible. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about how El Nino influences our winter. We're in a pretty decent-sized El Nino right now, so we'll see what happens. Hopefully not another ice storm. Hope you guys have a great New Year's, and I'll see you soon.
I gotta tell you, that's pretty scary. That's pretty scary when you think about, you know, the power's out, you're sitting at home with your family, you got no way to kind of heat yourselves, especially obviously, you know, below freezing temperatures and everything. And then you have this idea, you know what, I've got this old generator out the back, I'm going to bring it in and, you know, we're going to power it up and whatever else. And man, that's a loss of life that it's hard to get over. So, but that was pretty scary. You know, ices are pretty. You know, I live in Queensland, so we don't have that issue. You know, with ice and whatever else, it's snow, freezing temperatures, anything like that. But I could just imagine that struggle from day to day. You know, obviously even afterwards. You know, waiting for that power to come on, clearing the ice away. You know, once the ice melts and, you know, the water and everything else like that, it's just like, that's pretty horrific. That's pretty horrific, you know. So, you know, it's, as I said, you know, it's just those weather fronts all verging on this perfect little storm that produced it, you know. So, that was pretty scary. Very, very interesting. I had not heard of that before. So, you know, yeah, but those pictures and stories and everything, definitely an eye-opener. For somebody who lives in the tropics that doesn't have to deal with all that, it's pretty scary going, that's for sure. So let me know what you guys thought of that. Thank you very much for joining us today. Make sure you stay safe. And I'll definitely see you in the next reaction video. Oh, you're still here? You want more content? Why don't you check out my Patreon down here? You'll get plenty more content and some exclusive videos over there too. If not, why not check out this one over here?